Caitlin Clark is the reason why a lot of great things is going to happen for the WNBA. We have grown-ass men and women out here doing whatever they can to try to make sure that does not happen.
You know, I usually stay out of these conversations, but with Caitlin Clark, I can't stay silent anymore.
Picture a professional sports league at the peak of its powers. Sold-out arenas, record ratings, celebrities courtside. Then in a single moment, one player grabs her leg, limps off, and doesn't come back. Within days, more than half the audience vanishes. Not for one team, for the entire league. This is the story of what happened when Caitlin Clark went down, and how her absence exposed a truth the WNBA has spent years refusing to confront. Because this was never really about an injury. It was about a house of cards, and the wind that finally blew it over. Let's start with the number that should keep every WNBA executive awake at night, 55%. That's how much the audience for nationally televised games reportedly evaporated the moment Caitlin Clark was sidelined. Not shrank, not softened, collapsed. Before her injury, the story goes, the league was averaging around 1.8 million viewers. Within days of her going down, that figure supposedly cratered to roughly 847,000.
I'm sick of watching Caitlin getting attacked. If the league doesn't step up and protect her, things are going to get ugly real fast.
Those two numbers back to back and let them settle. That is not the gentle downward slope of summer fatigue or the natural ebb and flow that every sport experiences over a long season. That is a cliff, a sheer vertical drop with nothing to break the fall. And here's the part that separates this from an ordinary ratings story. It wasn't just Clark's team that suffered. If the Indiana Fever had lost viewers while she healed, that would make perfect sense. Fans tune in to see their star, but that's not what happened. The bleeding spread across the entire league. Games between franchises that had nothing whatsoever to do with Clark, teams on opposite ends of the country, matchups she would never have appeared in anyway, also hemorrhaged audience. Think about what that actually means. It means people weren't just skipping Fever games, they were switching off women's basketball entirely. They weren't being selective viewers who trimmed their habits at the margins. They were voting with the remote control, and the vote was overwhelming. No Clark, no reason to watch. That single fact reframes everything. This was never a Caitlin Clark problem. It was a WNBA problem that Caitlin Clark had been quietly, single-handedly hiding. The veteran sports journalist Christine Brennan reportedly posed a question that should have frozen every league official in their tracks. Has any athlete in the modern era ever exerted this kind of gravitational pull on an entire sport? One player limps to the bench, and more than half a league's television audience simply evaporates. It's worth sitting with that question rather than rushing past it, because the honest answer is deeply uncomfortable. We reach instinctively for comparisons. Tiger Woods, for instance. When Tiger was at his imperial peak, his presence unquestionably moved golf's ratings needle. When he wasn't in a tournament, the numbers dipped. Fans wanted Tiger because he was transcendent, a once-in-a-generation figure whose mere presence electrified the gallery and elevated every player around him. But even Tiger, at his most dominant, never triggered a league-wide implosion of this scale. When he was injured or stepped away, the PGA Tour didn't vanish. Other players filled the vacuum. New storylines emerged. The sport ran at a lower volume, sure, but it kept running. The infrastructure underneath golf was strong enough to survive the absence of its biggest star. Michael Jordan is probably the sharpest comparison anyone can reach for. Jordan didn't just play in the NBA, he practically was the NBA in the popular imagination. He dragged the sport into the mainstream, printed money, and became a global icon in a way no basketball player had before. And yet, here's the crucial point, even Jordan's injuries or absences never threatened to erase more than half the league's viewership overnight. Why? Because the NBA of that era had built something underneath its superstar. There were other luminaries generating their own gravity. There were rivalries and team narratives robust enough to carry a broadcast even when Jordan wasn't on the floor. The league could function, diminished perhaps, but functional without him. The WNBA, this crisis revealed, has no such foundation. And to be crystal clear, that is not an indictment of the talent on its rosters. The league is stuffed with brilliant, dedicated athletes. The problem is structural. Everything, the marketing, the narrative, the reason casual fans reach for the remote, had been compressed into a single point of light. One player, one story, one human being carrying the economic weight of an entire enterprise on her shoulders. That is not a sustainable business model, it's a bet, and the injury revealed just how badly that bet could go. The chronology matters because it tells you exactly what kind of audience the league had built. Clark went down in late June with a groin injury, the sequel to an earlier quad strain, and almost immediately the numbers started to slide. This wasn't a slow leak over a couple of weeks as viewers gradually drifted away. It was instant and it was brutal. Days, not weeks. That speed is the tell. Deep institutional fans, the ones who love a league as an institution, who follow the standings and the trades and the rookies and the veterans regardless of who's healthy, those fans don't disappear in 48 hours. They stick around. The audience that vanished this fast was, by definition, not that kind of fan. They were people who had discovered women's basketball through one specific person. She was the doorway. When the doorway closed, they simply left the building. And here's the detail that should trouble the league most of all. There was no recovery, no rebound. In the weeks that followed, viewers didn't slowly acclimate to watching other players. They didn't find new favorites or fresh reasons to stay engaged. The audience just stayed gone. That silence speaks volumes. It says the casual fan was never loyal to the WNBA. They were loyal to Clark and only Clark. You can't grasp the magnitude of this collapse without understanding what exactly was removed from the equation. Because Caitlin Clark isn't merely a good basketball player having a nice career. She is a genuine cultural phenomenon, and the scale of her impact is unlike anything in the league's nearly 3-decade history. She arrived as the #1 overall pick in 2024, carrying expectations that bordered on absurd. At Iowa, she had rewritten the NCAA record books, shattering scoring marks that had stood for decades. She was media-trained, camera-ready, and blessed with an almost supernatural composure under pressure. And yet, even with all that hype, nobody truly anticipated what would happen the instant she stepped onto a professional court. What she delivered was the one thing the WNBA had chased fruitlessly for nearly 30 years: mainstream relevance. She made women's basketball genuinely interesting to casual sports fans who had never given it a second thought. That is not a minor achievement. That is not adding a viewer here and there. That is a tectonic shift in how the culture perceived an entire sport. When Clark played, the games pulled numbers the league had only fantasized about. Outlets that never covered women's sports were suddenly running Clark features. Celebrities appeared at games. There was a cultural buzz around the WNBA that simply hadn't existed before. Attendance at fever games exploded. Venues had to be upgraded to bigger arenas to accommodate the crush of demand. A vibrant secondary ticket market appeared where none had existed, with fans paying premium prices to be in the building. And crucially, none of this was manufactured by clever league marketing. It was organic. It was real. It was demand, pure and simple. But her value went far beyond the stat sheet and the ticket receipts. Consider the kind of person she brought into the spotlight. She didn't arrive as a diva demanding special treatment. She came in as a humble rookie who reflexively deflected praise onto her teammates, spoke about her gratitude to be in the league, and paid public respect to the veterans who had built it before her. That humility, at her age and level of fame, was genuinely striking. It endeared her to fans and, importantly, gave her a maturity that suggested she understood her role was bigger than her personal numbers. She was also remarkably poised under fire. Not everyone welcomed her. Some veterans bristled at the tidal wave of attention crashing over a single rookie. Skeptics questioned whether she was overhyped, but Clark rarely took the bait. She answered criticism with grace and let her play speak for itself, a kind of emotional intelligence that can't be coached into someone. It's either there or it isn't. And the basketball itself, breathtaking. Her court vision, her ability to manufacture her own shot from impossible distances. Her sheer competitive fire. She wasn't a hollow volume scorer padding statistics. She played winning basketball that made her teammates better. She was, in the truest sense, a player who lifted everyone around her. There was symbolism, too. Clark represented a generation of female athletes raised with better training, deeper resources, and higher expectations than those who came before. She was living proof of what women's basketball could become if the sport were finally given the investment and infrastructure it deserved. The economics rippled outward in every direction. Clark merchandise flew off shelves. Teams that didn't even have her on their roster saw bumps in attendance and sales, because she was the gateway drug to the entire sport. Corporate sponsors who had never considered the WNBA suddenly wanted their logos attached to it, because Clark had made it culturally relevant. She was generating revenue in ways the league had never experienced. And she embraced all of it: the pressure, the responsibility of being the face of a movement. She understood her performance reflected on the whole sport, that her success could pry open doors for the generations behind her. That awareness seemed to push her to play even harder. She wasn't competing only for herself or her team. She was competing for the future of the game. Which is precisely what makes the story so tragic. She arrived with everything needed to permanently transform women's basketball: talent, personality, media presence, poise. She was the kind of generational figure you build a sport around. And instead of guarding that potential like the treasure it was, the league allowed conditions to develop that put her body at risk, and then watched the whole thing come apart. Here's what makes this crisis so maddening. It isn't new. The WNBA has walked this exact path before. Time and again, the league has watched a star player get injured, seen the ratings sag, felt the revenue slip, and struggled through the downturn. And time and again, it appears to have learned absolutely nothing. Each time, it drifts right back into the same habits that created the vulnerability in the first place. That is the very definition of failing to learn from history. You witness the disaster, you understand the cause, and then, when circumstances repeat, you make every single one of the same mistakes. That's not misfortune, that's not bad luck. That's organizational dysfunction, a league lacking the leadership or institutional memory to address its systemic problems with any consistency. The pattern viewed from a distance is one of boom and bust cycles orbiting individual stars. A player captures the public imagination. Ratings climb, revenue swells, optimism blooms. Then that player gets hurt, or their trajectory shifts, or they move on, and suddenly the league is back in the wilderness. Rather than using the boom years to construct durable infrastructure and cultivate multiple marketable stars, the league coasts on the momentum of a single figure. And when that momentum stalls, it's caught flat-footed because there's nothing underneath. It's like watching someone press their palm to a hot stove, recoil in pain, and then immediately reach for it again, insisting they had no idea it was hot. Except the WNBA isn't a person with a short memory. It's a professional organization with records, analysts, and the capacity to learn. The fact that it keeps repeating the same error points to something deeper than bad luck. Every previous instance of losing a star to injury or retirement should have functioned as a cautionary tale. The lessons were sitting right there. Depending on one player is dangerous. Boom period revenue must be reinvested to build depth at the marquee level. Protecting and promoting several stars is wiser than pouring all the light onto one. None of it seems to have sunk in. Compare this to how other leagues operate. When the NBA was constructing its modern empire, it didn't simply lean on Jordan. It deliberately cultivated other superstars and compelling franchises capable of carrying storylines on their own. Yes, Jordan was the headline act, but the machinery underneath could keep running without him. That was intentional. That was leadership that understood the peril of concentrating all your risk in one place. The NFL is even more instructive. No single player's presence dictates the entire league's viewership. Some stars move the needle more than others, of course, but the structure guarantees that every team gives its fans a reason to care. Every game carries stakes, and the ecosystem as a whole can absorb the loss of any individual. That robustness is by design, the product of leadership that grasped a simple truth: concentrated risk is fragile risk. The WNBA had every opportunity to study these examples. Instead, it seems to have operated on hope rather than strategy. Hope that its franchise cornerstones wouldn't get hurt. Hope that attention would sustain itself without active cultivation. Hope that the good times would simply keep rolling. And the specific manner of Clark's injury echoes the past, too. The targeting and rough treatment she absorbed all season is not without precedent. Diana Taurasi, another transcendent talent, weathered aggressive physical play at various points in her career. But the league didn't adequately address it then either. It treated brutal physicality as simply part of the game, rather than as a genuine threat to its most valuable assets that needed managing. What's truly galling is that all of this was preventable. The league could make different choices right now, even with Clark already sidelined. It could seize this moment to fundamentally rethink how it operates, implement real safety standards, invest in developing other stars, build a structure that thrives on multiple draws instead of a single point of failure. But the early evidence suggests it won't. The likelier path is to coast until Clark returns, pray the ratings snap back, and then slide right back into the patterns that created this mess. And that repeated failure to learn may ultimately be more corrosive than the original mistakes, because now there's a documented pattern. Now there's proof that the leadership either can't or won't make hard changes. That erodes the confidence of fans, players, sponsors, and media alike. Because if you know an organization keeps stepping on the same rake, why would you invest your time, your money, or your attention in it? The groin injury that ended Clark's summer was not a random bolt of lightning. It was, arguably, the predictable culmination of forces building all season long. To understand it, you have to start with the earlier quad strain serious enough to cost her 5 games. That's no minor tweak. That's significant damage to a major muscle group requiring genuine rest and rehabilitation. But instead of being a contained event with a tidy recovery arc, that quad strain became the first domino. Here's the biomechanics of it. When athletes injure a major muscle group, their bodies automatically reroute movement to protect the wounded area. They shift their weight, recruit other muscles, alter their gait. That compensation is a normal survival response, but it also breeds new vulnerabilities. In Clark's case, compensating for the quad likely piled stress onto neighboring muscles and joints. The groin sits anatomically close to the quad, and the movement adjustments that instinctively happen when guarding a quad injury can load the groin, which appears to be exactly what unfolded. Medical observers noted that the timing and location of the groin injury relative to the quad strain pointed straight at compensation as the culprit. It was a textbook injury cascade, one injury spawning another when the first isn't properly managed and healed. But now layer in the element that makes the league's failure so direct. While Clark was already managing the fallout from her quad, she was also absorbing relentless aggressive physical play. Game footage and analysis reportedly showed her being targeted throughout the season, fouled hard, bumped and hit beyond the bounds of normal basketball contact, played in a manner engineered to intimidate and at times to inflict discomfort. The Phoenix Mercury were said to be especially rough. Reports suggested that a striking share of the flagrant fouls committed against Clark, as much as 80% across a handful of games, came from Mercury players. That's not chance, that reads like a pattern. Some of it was overt, elbows, shoulder checks, plays plainly outside the spirit of competition. Some was subtler, repeated contact hovering right at the edge of a whistle, designed to grind her down over time. And the league's response? Effectively nothing. A foul called here and there, but no suspensions, no meaningful fines, no unambiguous signal to teams that this was unacceptable. Officials spoke in comfortable abstractions about letting them play and preserving competitive balance, but never backed those principles with consistent enforcement. Some commentators pointed out that the league treated physicality involving other players quite differently, and that this inconsistency amounted to tacit permission to rough up Clark. Now combine everything: a body already compensating for one injury, subjected to a steady barrage of physical punishment, all while managing the mental strain of playing through pain and altered mechanics. That is a recipe for a second injury, and the warning signs were visible. In her final games before the groin announcement, Clark's shooting cratered to levels utterly foreign to her, missing three-pointers at rates that contradicted everything fans knew about her. That kind of decline from an elite shooter isn't random noise, it's the signature of something physical interfering with performance. Pain, compensation, a body quietly waving a red flag. Which raises the haunting question: was anyone watching closely enough? When a player's production suddenly falls off a cliff, that should trigger evaluation. There should have been hard conversations about workload, pain, and possible injury. There should have been additional testing. The apparent failure to catch and address it in time is a failure of the medical and coaching support around her. Medical experts are unanimous on one point: rushing a player back from a groin injury is genuinely dangerous. Groin injuries can turn chronic if mishandled. They can spawn compensatory patterns that trigger yet more injuries. They can take months to fully heal, and returning too early dramatically raises the risk of re-injury. The responsible move is to give Clark all the time her body needs. But responsibility collides with desperation. More time off means the ratings stay depressed. It means the financial picture keeps darkening. So the league faces an ugly choice: protect Clark's long-term health or protect its short-term revenue. That shouldn't even be a dilemma. Player health has to win every time. But the financial panic creates pressure to rush her back, pressure that runs directly counter to her well-being. It's yet another way the mismanagement has manufactured a situation where nobody's interests are truly served. The financial fallout was swift, brutal, and still spreading, and it reaches far beyond television ratings. Start with tickets. Suddenly, Fever games became dramatically more affordable, which sounds like good news until you understand why. Ticket prices reportedly fell by around 71% almost overnight. Seats that had been commanding $860 could be had for $250. That's not a market correction. That's a devaluation that lays bare exactly how much of that price was Clark and Clark alone. The collapse got starker at the individual game level. A marquee Los Angeles-Sparks Indiana Fever matchup, one of the season's most anticipated, reportedly saw ticket prices tumble from $210 to $95. This was supposed to be a showcase: two good teams, national exposure, the promise of a great night of basketball. Before the injury, there was every reason for excitement. Without Clark, that same game lost its magic in the eyes of the casual buyer. The road games are perhaps the most revealing data point of all. The Fever had scheduled contests in larger arenas specifically to soak up the extraordinary demand a healthy Clark generated. Those upgraded venues sat conspicuously empty. Fans who would have happily driven to another city to see Clark simply weren't interested in watching the same teams without her. Which tells you, in the plainest possible terms, what they'd been buying tickets to see: Clark, not women's basketball as a concept. The pain radiated into local economies. Hotels near arenas reported softer bookings. Restaurants that thrived on pre-game foot traffic went quiet. Parking, concessions, and all the little revenue streams that feed on attendance shrank. This wasn't just the league's problem, it was a hit to entire local economies that had come to rely on the Clark surge. Then there's sponsorship, where the damage may cut deepest of all. Companies had poured millions into WNBA deals betting on continued growth. These are typically multi-year contracts with budgets built around expected returns. When your audience drops by 55%, the math on those deals gets ugly fast. A brand that paid to reach 1.8 million viewers a game is now reaching fewer than 850,000, half the eyeballs for the same price. Some sponsors are already asking whether the investment still makes sense, and if the league's entire value proposition rests on one player staying healthy, sponsorship becomes a high-risk gamble. Sponsors crave predictability. They want to know the asset they're paying for will deliver consistent value. An injury that can erase half that value obliterates the predictability. Renewal conversations that should have been routine are now tense negotiations about whether the league is even worth it. Merchandise told the same story. During the boom, Clark Gear was practically printing money, jerseys, apparel, collectibles, all of it moving briskly. With her sidelined, those sales reportedly cratered. People don't buy jerseys of players they aren't watching. The retail and distribution infrastructure built around her popularity now sits underused. The season's financial projections turned grim. The league was already reportedly starring at losses in the neighborhood of $50 million before Clark went down, and that figure looks destined to climb. Fold in the lost ticket revenue, the diminished broadcast value, the softening sponsorships, the merchandise slump, and the collateral damage to local businesses, and the total economic impact runs into the hundreds of millions. And it cascades into team operations and ultimately player salaries. Franchises that budgeted for Clark-driven windfalls now face shrunken revenues. They may have to trim spending on facilities and staff. Worst of all, the collective bargaining negotiations looming at season's end will be conducted against the backdrop of this collapse. The league will argue it simply cannot afford significant salary increases because its finances have deteriorated. Technically true, but a self-inflicted wound. And looking further out, if the WNBA can't prove the Clark-era surge was sustainable, new sponsors will hesitate and existing ones may walk. The lasting impression that women's basketball's popularity is fragile and hitched to a single person could hobble the league's ability to attract investment for years. Here's where the story turns from a business case study into something more troubling, because what happened to the viewership wasn't purely about a missing star. A significant chunk of it was a credibility crisis. Many people didn't stop watching simply because Clark was hurt and would eventually return. They stopped watching as a form of protest. They made a conscious decision to switch off because they no longer believed the league was being run competently or fairly. That's a fundamentally different beast than temporary absence. This is fans deciding they don't trust the institution anymore. They don't believe it protects its players. They don't believe its games are officiated fairly. They don't believe its leadership has the sport's genuine interests at heart, and trust, once shattered, is far harder to rebuild than ratings. The commentary bore this out. Critics hammered the league for allowing the physical targeting of Clark to continue unchecked. They questioned why it hadn't implemented safety standards to prevent the very environment that likely contributed to her injuries, and all that anger crystallized into the simplest possible act of protest: turning off the TV. What makes this credibility wound so severe is that it isn't built on vibes or subjective grievance. The physical play was captured on video. The league's failure to respond with real consequences is a matter of record. The ratings collapse is measurable data. These aren't opinions, they're facts fans can point to and say, the league failed to protect its most valuable player and now everyone's paying for it. The perception that leadership doesn't care about protecting its stars set off a chain reaction. Fans stopped watching not just Fever games but any WNBA game as a blanket expression of frustration. That's a far harsher verdict than mere disinterest in a particular team. The broader narrative hardened into something damaging, that the WNBA is mismanaged and doesn't take itself seriously as a professional league. If it did, the argument runs, it would protect its stars the way other leagues do. It would enforce safety standards consistently. It would recognize which players are disproportionately valuable to the whole ecosystem and structure its rules to protect them. Instead, it appeared to let chaos and rough play dictate the outcome of Clark's games, the opposite of what a serious league does. Some of the sharpest commentary questioned the league's very values. One analyst argued that permitting the targeting of Clark while professing to care about player safety was simple hypocrisy. Another suggested the physical play may have been fueled by resentment, jealousy from players and coaches who chafed at Clark's star power and the attention lavished on her. Rather than managing that dynamic and shielding Clark, the league let it fester. That's not just poor management, it's a failure of leadership at the foundational level. The league's public messaging only deepened the hole. Officials kept invoking letting them play and competitive balance even as evidence mounted that Clark was being singled out. That kind of communication, ignoring an obvious problem while hiding behind abstractions, reads as defensive and inauthentic. It suggests leadership either doesn't understand what's happening or is choosing to look away. Neither inspires confidence. There's an even longer shadow here. If the next generation of young female athletes watches how the league handled a generational talent whose safety wasn't adequately protected, some may conclude that professional basketball isn't a safe or serious environment for them. That has real consequences for the talent pipeline the league depends on to survive. When your own fans tell you they won't watch without your biggest star because they don't trust the games to be called fairly, you don't have a ratings problem, you have a trust problem, and that's far more dangerous. You can spike ratings overnight by bringing a star back. You cannot spike trust. Trust is rebuilt slowly through consistent action, demonstrated commitment, and decisions that prove leadership genuinely cares about what it claims to value. This credibility crisis will outlast Clark's recovery. Even if she returns and plays at her old level, fans will remember that the league failed to protect her, that chances to fix the problem were squandered, that leadership seemed more interested in permitting drama than in safeguarding its franchise player. Those memories don't evaporate just because the immediate emergency passes. If a single word captures this entire saga, it's preventable. Every phase of this crisis was avoidable. At each fork in the road, the league could have chosen differently. It just didn't. The most glaring missed exit came early, when the physical play against Clark first became conspicuous. Rather than tolerate the fouling and targeting, the league could have issued clear guidance to teams about what contact would and would not be permitted. It could have made explicit that its most visible player and primary draw would receive the same protection other sports afford their stars. That would have set the tone, for teams, coaches, and players alike. Instead came the vague talk of letting them play. That language handed teams implicit permission to keep hammering away. It communicated that as long as fouls were called with some regularity, the rough approach was tolerable. In that permissive climate, targeting Clark became normalized, even expected. Everyone understood that a hard foul might draw a whistle maybe a third of the time. Those odds practically incentivized the physicality. The league also could have managed the initial quad strain differently. When Clark first went down, the right move might have been to guarantee her full recovery before returning. But rather than prioritize her health, the pull toward getting her back to rescue the ratings won out. A more conservative approach might have prevented the compensatory cascade that produced the groin injury altogether. In the weeks between the two injuries, there were more chances to intervene. When Clark's play visibly deteriorated, that should have prompted a deeper look, a serious conversation, additional testing, a hard question about whether something was wrong. Proactive monitoring might have caught the groin problem early enough to manage it carefully. It apparently didn't. But the most fundamental missed opportunity was strategic. During the boom, the sold-out arenas, the flying merchandise, the record ratings, the league could have plowed that windfall into building something durable. It could have developed and promoted other marketable players, featured other stars on national broadcasts, and built narratives around other teams to create a more distributed fan base. That would have manufactured redundancy, alternative draws capable of sustaining interest when Clark wasn't available. It could have invested in a brand bigger than any one player. Rather than making women's basketball synonymous with a single name, it could have made the sport itself the story, documentaries, deep dives into other players and franchises, content celebrating the league as a whole. That kind of foundation would have made the league far more resilient. The contrast with other leagues is unforgiving. When the NBA rode the wave of Jordan's peak years, it simultaneously nurtured other storylines, Duncan in San Antonio, Malone and Stockton in Utah, so that even when Jordan sat, compelling narratives carried the broadcast. That created depth. That sustained the league through absences. The WNBA had the resources to do the same. It had the boom revenue, the platform, the infrastructure. It simply didn't prioritize it. It assumed the good times would roll on without active stewardship. That's not strategy, that's wishing for luck. And the warning signs were flashing. The targeting was documented. The league's dependence on one player was obvious. The shortage of marketable stars was plain, yet no course correction came. That's the essence of a leadership failure, having the information, the ability, and the resources to act and choosing not to. Now the league must live with those choices, and so must every fan, player, sponsor, and community that invested in the dream of women's basketball. The most consequential conversation of the coming months isn't being discussed as openly as it should be, but it hangs over everything. At season's end, the WNBA enters collective bargaining negotiations. These talks will determine player salaries, benefits, contractual protections, and the resources devoted to safety and facilities. And the numbers on the table will be shaped directly by Clark's injury and the collapse it triggered. This is where the mismanagement threatens to become permanent. When the league's negotiators sit across from the players' union, they'll point to the 55% viewership crater. They'll cite falling ticket sales, softening franchise valuations, and cooling sponsor interest. All of it will become ammunition for a single argument: the league can't afford meaningful raises. The financial picture, they'll say, is more fragile than it looked, so players must temper their demands. What makes this uniquely unjust is that the deterioration didn't stem from the sport failing or the business fundamentals being weak. It stemmed from mismanagement, specifically around the most valuable player in the game. The players now stand to be punished financially for the league's failure to protect and promote their own colleague. That injustice is baked into the very structure of the negotiations. The union will fight back, of course. It will argue that the Clark-era surge proved there is enormous latent demand for women's basketball when the league properly markets its stars. It will argue that the viewership drop during her absence isn't evidence the league can't pay more. It's evidence the league's value is so high that a single player's absence causes hundreds of millions in impact. It will push to use these negotiations to force structural changes that protect both players and the league's finances going forward. But even airtight arguments don't rewrite the leverage. If one side can point to fresh financial deterioration as proof it can't spend more, that's a formidable position. The other side can debate the asterisk cause all it wants, but it can't dispute the numbers themselves. The ratings drop is real, the ticket decline is real, the sponsorship cooling is real, and all of it will push the talks in a direction less favorable to players than it would have been otherwise. It could get more contentious still. The league might weaponize the injury as a broader argument about vulnerability, claiming that because so much value is concentrated in a few players, it needs to moderate salary growth to build a financial buffer against future disruptions. It might use the moment to push for revenue-sharing terms tilted in its favor, or to resist demands for better facilities and medical care. The timing is especially cruel for the union, because this was supposed to be their moment of maximum leverage. Women's basketball is more popular than ever. Media coverage is at record highs. Sponsors have shown real appetite. The conditions were perfect for players to secure historic gains. Instead, that leverage has been kneecapped by a collapse that flowed from the league's own failures. The union's negotiating power was damaged not by anything players did, but by mismanagement above their heads. There's a dangerous precedent lurking here too. If the league can point to a self-inflicted crisis and use it to justify holding down salaries, it establishes that whenever finances sour, for any reason, players are expected to accept less. That's not how professional sports negotiations are supposed to function. But desperate circumstances breed unusual dynamics. The players face hard strategic questions. If they accept a weaker deal now based on today's distress, will they get to renegotiate when the finances recover? Or will they be locked into unfavorable terms for years? And should they trade modest salary gains for guaranteed structural protections, enforcement of safety standards, investment in medical and coaching infrastructure framed as, "we'll take less money if you commit to changes that protect our health," perhaps? But that gambit only works if they trust the league to honor those commitments. If leadership refuses to guarantee real change, the players are essentially being asked to accept less now on faith that future money will be safer. That's a bad bet. Strip away the numbers and the narratives, and the WNBA's crisis moment reduces to a single question about leadership. The league had everything it could possibly need to build something sustainable and transformative: unprecedented interest, historic ratings, mainstream attention, and a once-in-a-generation talent capable of lifting the entire sport. And rather than guarding that foundation and building upward, it let circumstances erode it all. Now it's living with the wreckage: collapsed viewership, damaged credibility, sponsorship uncertainty, and a bargaining season that will unfold against a backdrop of financial decline. The only question that matters now is whether this becomes a genuine turning point, the moment the league finally learns to protect its assets and construct real, durable infrastructure, or just another crisis it survives until the next boom cycle rolls around and the cycle begins again. Based on everything we've seen, optimism is hard to justify, but the stakes have never been higher. The players deserve better. The fans deserve better. And the sport itself, which has waited nearly 3 decades for a moment like this, deserves far better than a league determined to keep touching the same hot stove. Everything that happens next hinges on a single, uncomfortable question. Is the WNBA finally ready to learn?